Dickens and Race presents a distinctive contextual exploration of Charles Dickens' interactions with the theme of race within the context of his lesser-known journalism. The broader debates of the 19th century concerning human differences, imperial issues, and the race exhibitions of London. A question that emerges is whether Charles Dickens, the celebrated Victorian novelist known as a social critic and defender of the oppressed, advocated for genocide on behalf of the British Empire. Laura Peters tackles this question in her new book, Dickens and Race, published to coincide with the bicentenary of this prominent literary figure from the Victorian era. With expertise in 19th century literature, Peters delves into Dickens' literature, journalism, and correspondence to present a comprehensive, incisive, and thought-provoking exploration of his often contentious perspectives on racial distinctions. The book traces how Dickens' initial thoughts on race are influenced by his youthful escapades into the world of African adventure stories and other narratives from his childhood, such as Tales of the Arabian Nights and Robinson Crusoe. As he matured, Dickens increasingly embraced the narrative of science to deepen his understanding of racial diversity. While his views on race evolved, Peters contends that his reflections were consistently molded by two influential concepts: the idea of the exotic of fancy and the scientific narrative of racial thinking. In the third chapter, Peters meticulously examines Dickens' 1853 essay on the noble savage, asserting that it is part of a continuum of racial contemplation spanning more than a decade. This differs from the perspective of Grace Moore, another Dickens scholar, who contends that the essay contradicts Dickens' broader body of work. Peters adeptly contextualizes the noble savage by investigating the practice of exhibiting different racial groups, and by emphasizing ongoing dialogues about slavery, as well as Dickens' own visit to America in 1842. Within the essay, Dickens underscores a dichotomy between civilization and savagery, in which race plays a pivotal role. He dismisses the notion of nobility in other races by deeming them biologically inferior. One of the most contentious quotes from The Noble Savage emerges when Dickens asserts, "I call a savage something highly desirable to be civilized off the face of the earth." While scholars like Bernd Linfers have contended that Dickens was advocating for cultural, not literal genocide, Peters casts doubt on this perspective in the subsequent chapter. Chapter 4 of the book delves into Dickens' response to the 1857 Indian Mutiny, an event referred to in India as their first war of independence. Media coverage during that time focused on unfounded allegations of forced cannibalism, which contributed to a discourse of extermination. Peters characterizes Dickens' letter during this period as advocating genocide as a response to the Indian Mutiny. Her in-depth analysis of the literature from this era concludes that this rhetoric of extermination persisted throughout the 1850s and beyond, escalating ominously until it evolved into deadly eugenic rhetoric at the turn of the century. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 also left its mark on one of Dickens' most renowned works, A Tale of Two Cities, published in 1859, just 2 years after the Indian Uprising. In this novel set during the lead-up to and during the French Revolution, Dickens underscores the racial distinction of the French revolutionaries, depicting them as dusky. Similar to his portrayal of the Indian Uprising, this narrative casts the French revolutionaries as savages, murderous mobs, and cannibals, with the heroic characters being primarily British. This portrayal of France extends the colonial notion of British civilization, juxtaposed with foreign savagery. Through elements like cannibalism, Dickens continues to perceive the world through the lens of the exotic, even as this perspective was increasingly challenged by the scientific discourses of the 1860s. Chapter 5 delves into how Dickens' views underwent transformation following the publication of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species in 1859. A work that permanently altered societal conceptions of race. These burgeoning scientific discourses prompted a crisis in Dickens' lifelong engagement with imaginative thinking, which began to wane in transformative influence as rational knowledge gained prominence. Notably absent from this final chapter is Herbert Spencer's influence, which is pertinent to Dickens' writing throughout the 1860s. Spencer introduced the concept of survival of the fittest in his 1864 book Principles of Biology, aligning closely with Dickens' expressions in his later years. In the latter phase of his life, Dickens increasingly linked neglected children, degeneration, and savagery. This period saw him addressing savagery in London, particularly among the street children of Covent Garden in his final completed novel, Our Mutual Friend. Peter's research uncovers an unconventional interpretation of Dickens' portrayal of poverty, suggesting he viewed the East End of London as a site of a degenerating race of urban poor. This perspective, which intertwines evolutionary concepts with social issues, was championed by Herbert Spencer and would later be recognized as social Darwinism. This book provides a fresh perspective on Charles Dickens' views on race, revealing their evolution under the influence of debates, discoveries, and historical occurrences. These elements are meticulously situated within their social, political, and historical contexts. Consequently, the book holds significant potential as a valuable resource across a variety of disciplines. A compelling realization upon reading this book is how little popular discourses concerning race and poverty have progressed since the era of Charles Dickens.